Well, it's time to get back into the subject of prophecy. This particular point that we're going to cover, the arise of the King of the North, is a big one. I want to give it in detail because so many people lost what we have. Great numbers of God's people once understood much of what we are covering here. Many, I have learned through the years, never took the time to understand the passing of different events, different prophetic mile markers. They never internalized the flow of what the Bible plainly shows would happen, what the church taught, for those who are willing to understand it. So I've learned that even with God's people, I am sometimes repeating what they knew, but often repeating what they never knew. And then there, of course, there's some, well, I kind of understood that, but I didn't exactly know how it would work. Or I'd heard it before, but never understood it. Sometimes never understood it at all. They can maybe remember a point, but can't recall how it fit. Now, in the spring of 1945, Europe lay in ruins. Germany was destroyed and divided. Yet there was one lone voice on earth who declared with authority and emphasis that Germany and Europe will rise again. Revelation 17 and verse 9 talks about the mind that has wisdom. Here is the mind which has wisdom. Now, God used Herbert Armstrong to explain what I'm covering here today and much, much more prophetically. 1/3 of the Bible is prophecy. But he was, individually speaking at least, the mind which had wisdom. He had the wisdom that comes from God, the same wisdom that Solomon had, only he had an extraordinary, unique wisdom, or we'll say understanding, in addition, as to how to put all the heads and horns and toes and images and beasts of Revelation and Daniel 2 and 7 and Revelation 13 and 17 together. There have been thousands and thousands of so-called Bible scholars who tried to put together the Rubik's Cube of those events. Many thought they did, but most admitted it was just too complicated. And many concluded that God never wanted it understood. In other words, he recorded all of this in his word, but never wanted it understood, which goes directly against Revelation 1, verses 1 to 3, which says God's servants would understand. If they were obeying him and keeping all of the words of the rest of his book, the Bible, they would understand the book of Revelation. Now, in the new atomic age, Hiroshima and Nagasaki had brought us to that point. Europe realized its very survival was at stake. Europe had been a place where wars had taken place for centuries, and perhaps better described as millennia. But now there were super weapons, things that Hitler dreamed of having but never quite achieved. His Manhattan bomb and other nuclear devices that he was actively working on never came to fruition. The ultimate arms race, which would have decided the future of the world, and it was taking place in the early to mid-1940s, where we knew he was trying to build nuclear weapons. He may or may not have understood that the United States was, but we understood it was the absolute race of races. Whoever got that super weapon, atomic bombs, now of course they're hydrogen bombs and super hydrogen bombs, but whoever got the kind of bombs that would erase whole cities in an instant would rule the world. In effect, Hitler said he would bring 1,000 years of peace to Europe. It's hard to imagine a dictatorship that would ever relinquish that weapon to anybody else, would ever allow anyone else to get that weapon. But in fact, Europe was not the first power to come up with nuclear weapons. The United States was, and of course, some European scientists fled or were captured and taken into the Soviet Union, and the Soviets developed nuclear weapons. And that was an unstable regime which ultimately broke up, so nuclear weapons proliferated. But basically, the nuclear weapons of Europe are ours that were there. The French ultimately developed them, so did the British. But Europe, this place of constant war, needed the same weapons. They needed a new means to survive. They could just no longer survive the periodic continental, shall we say, conflagrations, which was Europe's Achilles heel. Always war. I mean, there was the 20 Years' War, there's the 25-year war. Britain and France fought what's called the 100 Years' War. 100 years. You can appreciate just with that one fact how constant has been war on that continent. So an age-old idea resurfaced in the wake of World War II, and a really celebrated speech of the time, most don't remember it, Winston Churchill suggested there was only one solution to Europe's future, a future in doubt. And here's what he said, I quote, "We must build a kind of United States of Europe." September 19th, 1946. Winston Churchill said that. Not Adolf Hitler, not the Pope, not the modern beast. Winston Churchill said it. But how could you do that? The answer was found in the following formula, which was devised, mentioned by Churchill, but devised and recognized by others. And here's what it was. It's summarized in the following way. Fuse the economic destinies of the European states, especially France and Germany, because they fought more than the French and the English, so tightly that another intra-European war simply could not occur. Then, following economic unity, would come political unity, which would automatically give birth to and be backed up by military unity. Now, of course, within all of that would be religious unity. Well, let's look at a little history. The first step was called Benelux. That stands for Belgium, Netherlands, and Luxembourg. Formed a joint customs union. Those three countries, let me repeat, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg, or Benelux as it was referred to. And it began operation on January 1st, 1948. The goal was to gradually reduce duties and tariffs on commerce between these three small member nations to promote increased trade among themselves. Kind of a humble and fairly simple beginning. Only about 16 months, 15 and a half months after Churchill had said what he did. In 1950, Robert Schuman, then French foreign minister, submitted a proposed draft by Jean Monnet for the pooling of the coal and steel resources of France and Germany. The project extended to Italy and, of course, included the Benelux countries. And by the Treaty of Paris in April 1951, the European Coal and Steel Company, ECSC as it's called sometimes, was formed. In 4 years, by 1955, steel production had soared 36%, making the ECSC the second largest steel producer in the world. Just about, little less than 10 years after Europe lay destroyed. Of course, first in steel production was the United States. Well, then came the European Atomic Energy Commission, then the Treaty of Rome, signed in March of 1957 and effective January 1st of 58, and that formed the Common Market, known officially as the European Economic Community, or the EEC. There were 6 charter members. They eventually, by the mid-80s, became 12. Sometimes they were called the 12, or they were referred to as the EC, the Economic Community. Now we would call it the European Union. And today, and frankly for the last 20 years, Europe has been the strongest industrial and trading combine on the face of the earth. Now, China is making a run at her, and we'll talk about that. But in effect, if you understand prophecy, and we're going to look at several verses beginning now, modern prophesied Tyre had been born. Whether you say it was born on January 1st, 48, April of 51, or maybe the idea was born September 19th, 1946, in Churchill's famous speech, or the Treaty of Rome, March 25th, 57, or when it went to more nations from 6 to 12, whenever you might say it, some decades ago now began modern Tyre, and it's only grown stronger. Now, God long ago decided to use the ancient city of Tyre to reflect this great modern system that would come back one more time in Europe, more powerfully than ever before, with results so disastrous the world has never seen the like. Now, Tyre was a coastal city, 100 miles north of Jerusalem, maybe a little bit west if you drew a line. I should say primarily north. I've been there. It was one of the greatest trading cities of the ancient world, famous for a long time, and it became the perfect type of this present, and I would even add, of course, future, great European commercial system. Let me tell you, Europe sees what China is doing. Europe understands India, which was once a colony of Europe. Hong Kong was once a colony of the British, and of course India as well. Europe has eyes. These are highly educated people, culturally speaking, for centuries. They understand they are threatened by the East. They understand that the United States has dominated the world, and they sit in the middle. And as I've said before, while the world thinks in terms of East and West, God talks in terms of North, South, and East in the final configuration of prophecy, because the West ceases to exist as we know it. All right, now, Isaiah chapter 23, the burden of Tyre. Howl, you ships of Tarshish, for it is laid waste, so that there is no house, no entering in from the land of Shittim. It is revealed to them. I don't have time to get into all the particulars of this. Be still, you inhabitants of the isle. The ships of Tarshish pretty much refers to Japan. There are two branches of Tarshish. Some of the descendants of Tarshish went to Spain, others went to Japan. That's another long story. Be still, you inhabitants of the isle, the Japanese isle. The Japanese, by the way, are watching world events, and their mortal enemies, who they are sort of getting along with, the Chinese, have taken the lead over them, much like the mortal enemies of Russia and Japan are sort of trying to get along these days. You whom the merchants of Zidon that pass over the sea have replenished, and by great waters, the seed of Sihor, the harvest of the river, is her revenue. We're still talking about Tyre, not these other names. And she is, Tyre, the mart of nations. Now, down the street, we have Kmart. Down the street, we also have Walmart. The mart of nations, there it is in your Bible, most people don't think of it. There is this place called Tyre, referenced as the mart of nations. Now, Kmart used to be the biggest thing in retail around, and it's been pretty much isolated or relegated to third world status, if you might compare it, by Walmart. Walmart's the biggest, I believe, the biggest retail corporation in the world. It is, in a sense, as one corporation might be described, it is the mart of nations. Walmarts are everywhere, of course, outside the United States, and more are coming, and if you work for them, you love them. If you don't, you hate them. And that's almost much the way it's going to be for this coming final system of Tyre, the Roman system. Europe today is the mart of nations. Everything still pretty much passes through Europe. I realize there are, what, $6 to $8 trillion pass through just Wall Street, lower Manhattan, every day. Understand, a lot of money still passes through this country, and that's just that location. But as far as goods and services, the very best that the world has to offer generally comes from Europe. Verse 8 says, "Who has taken counsel against Tyre, the crowning city, whose merchants are princes?" Nobody will be able to move against this system until it's God's purpose. "Whose merchants are princes, whose traffickers are the honorable of the earth."